Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and good afternoon. And once again, welcome to our session on data protection strategies using cryptography for Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista. My name is Rafał Lukawiecki, or if you happen to speak Polish, it's Rafał Łukawiecki, of course. I don't work for Microsoft. I work for a small UK-based consulting company called Project Botticelli Limited, and I very much welcome your questions during and after the session. If you would like to ask me later any questions which I haven't had the chance to address during our 75 minutes, please send them by email to the address you see on the screen. I have only one request to ask you of as much as I can. Please mark your questions as urgent if they are really urgent. Otherwise, I will definitely answer your question, but it takes me between 3 and 4 weeks normally to turn them around. Right, I'm not very good with email. Ladies and gentlemen, why have I created this session for you? Let me share with you the objectives that I would like to accomplish in the next 74 minutes or so. First and foremost, and the most important thing that I would like to do here is I would like to help you protect your data. There are many ways in which data can be protected. However, amazingly, almost all of them require the use of cryptography one way or another. So one thing that I would like to also do now in this session is to tell you what is possibly wrong with cryptography now and how you can fix it, or what you should do to have it fixed, so that in the real world your data is as protected as you have chosen it to be. I also want to highlight a number of outstanding issues. Not everything is beautiful and rosy in this world of data protection. Some of the things are slightly inconsistent. And one of the biggest issues that I know you are always faced with is the number of choices. There are so many cryptographic algorithms, and there is no one which is best for everything. One is better for one or for other purpose, maybe incompatible with yet another purpose. So one of the big objectives for my session is to clear that. I want to demystify for you cryptography as it is used for data protection as much as it is possible. So that's my plan, to help you protect your data. And in order to achieve those objectives, I have restructured this session into a number of convenient to explain and access sections, beginning at the very first stage with the introduction to the subject of data protection, which I will follow through with a nice section on cryptography, which includes a little hidden section for those of you who perhaps are a little bit rusty with regards to the basics of cryptography. I assume, as it is level 300 session, that all of you are familiar with the concept of symmetric, asymmetric, and hybrid cryptography. If you are not, you can, of course, access these slides anytime you want online. Right now, as a matter of fact, if you use the wireless and get my deck, you can quickly go through the hidden 10 or so slides on the primer and you will be absolutely fine. After that, we'll jump into cryptography of today and what's wrong with it, or what's good with it. Immediately after that, I will introduce our hero of the session, which is Suite B of cryptographic algorithms and the way they are supported in Windows Vista 2000 Server and 2008. No, I got that all wrong. In Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista. It was easier to say Longhorn, but we're not allowed to say that anymore. SMIME will be the first practical application that we will discuss, followed by IPsec, or IP security. Then I know everybody's waiting for a few words on BitLocker. I would like to begin the session with BitLocker, but it would be very boring because I would have to introduce all of the cryptographic stuff first. So that's why I talk about cryptography first, then BitLocker, and it's really easy that way. EFS, or the encrypting file system, and finally the information rights management, or RMS, will be the final subject of this presentation before we conclude. I have a warning to you. This is a very fast and intensive session, so hold on to your seats. If you find that this is too fast for you, well, I have something special for you. I will explain it when I come to the first slide on cryptography a little later, but there is a special present for you in the slide decks if you decide to download them. So without any further ado, let's introduce data protection. First of all, you, I hope, know very well defense in depth. And you know that defense in depth, like this layered security structure, assumes that any layer can be penetrated, but it is very unlikely, if you do it right, that every layer would be penetrated because the probabilities, of course, compose in a way that reduce the overall chance of penetration. What is at the very top, or if you sometimes look at it at the very bottom, normally, of this diagram? Naturally, data protection. Data protection is at the very heart of your defense in depth. That tells you immediately two things. First of all, this is the last defense for your data when everything else has been broken, which means that you don't have to be too paranoid about it, although I have to because that's my job. Secondly, you need to understand that data protection, by being right at the very heart, will be very difficult to do consistently across your enterprise. And in some places you have to do more of it and better. In other places you can be a little bit slacking off if you want to. Where and how you need to assess by means of threat modeling and analysis. However, because I know not all of you have done that yet in your organization, in this session I want to help you by giving you some common recommendations. Whenever I give you common recommendations, you must remember two things. First of all, they may not apply to you because you may be unique. Maybe you are in the military world, or perhaps your most expensive data is only worth €1, in which case you probably don't need to worry about it. Two, did you know that these sessions are recorded for the first time at SEC303 IT Forum for your viewing pleasure in the future, apparently in high definition? Well, if you view it in the future, check your watch. If it says 2007 or 2008, you probably can apply my recommendations. If it says 2009 or it is later, you probably need to ignore 30% of what I said. If it's 2006, you need to fix your TARDIS. Any form of digital security relies on physical security of key assets. I've created this slide something like 7 years ago, and I'm still showing it because people just don't get it. You will. It's so simple. No matter how wonderful is your digital security, you must also have good physical security for your key assets. A key asset could be the password of one of your very powerful users, such as an admin. Or it could be the private key for the SSL certificates. Or it could be the private key for IPsec, which provide domain isolation in your organization. Whatever the case is, that physical security is very important and difficult to do. Unfortunately, very often I see a world where we use the best digital security we have. Sweet be this, sweet be that. Will never help you. If physical security of your key asset is weak, you will be insecure. Traditionally, that meant protecting servers and hard drives in them with some additional forms of protection, such as buildings, guards, maybe additional mechanisms. And traditionally, it has been, of course, very difficult for laptop and workstation, movable workstation users. Things have improved, but it is still the case that that insecure environment is always easier to get, no matter how good is your digital security if you have no physical security or it's weak. And of course, the opposite is also true in a trivial way. No matter how good is your physical security, if you don't use modern digital security, naturally you will be insecure too. So, being practical, let me give you a few suggestions how to achieve good physical security. Obfuscate it is the first stage. Obfuscate means hide it a bit, but not perfectly. That will make it more difficult to find it for a casual attacker. Perhaps someone who passes through. Maybe one of the more automated attacks on the web will also be deferred this way. But that's not the best, and that's certainly not enough for your most important assets. 2, encrypt it. The only problem with that is that if you encrypt it, you will end up with an encryption key. which you then have to protect physically. So what would you do with that key? Well, for example, you could encrypt it. Of course, then you have a private key that you need to protect, so you can encrypt it. Okay, if you do about 4 times, that's more or less what BitLocker does. But you still have that private key that you have to stick somewhere, or a password that needs to be protected. So, number 3 choice, lock it somewhere where it is difficult to remove it without upsetting the computer. The 2 traditional places will be a smart card or a trusted platform module. TPM, and the reason we need them is because they, like a smart card, protect such a secret quite well. So if somebody tries to take it out of your computer too hard, well, it locks out and doesn't let the user to that first physical asset. Yes, if you have, enormous amount of resources and you perhaps work for the manufacturer of TPMs and a few other ifs, you probably can get that secret, so it's not perfect. But it is one of the best places today to secure your key asset. But let's not forget about one of my most favorite techniques, number 4, print it on a piece of paper. I love that. It is easily one of the best mechanisms for very strong protection. Of course, you need to hide that piece of paper somewhere secure, and if you have perhaps a boss in your company that happens to drive a suitably expensive car, they probably keep the keys to that car in a secure place. That's normally a good place to keep that piece of paper. And if you don't happen to have that luxury, well, there are a few other choices. You can print it, cut it in half, and put the 2 halves into different places. In fact, you could cut it in as many halves as you want. Those techniques work very, very well. Now remember, the more you cut that piece of paper, the more difficult it is assembling it when you need it. So watch out. All righty. You know that this session is about cryptography. And the reason it is so is because at the heart of every data protection mechanism that really works and matters, cryptography fulfills its primary function in different ways. What's confusing is that one algorithm can be used for so many purposes. And what's also confusing is that the way we protect keys, recover the keys, deploy, manage, and the purpose for which we use these mechanisms differ. So when I'm building this session, the thing that was going through my head about you is that you probably have seen, for example, the word AES used in at least 3 contexts with regards to at least Vista, and perhaps in 4 contexts with regards to Windows Server 2008. So I'm first going to go through the algorithms quickly, then through the purposes, and you'll make that connection. This way you'll know the best of both, of course, worlds. So, enough of an introduction. Let's talk now about the state of today's cryptography, and in particular, what's wrong with it? How could you fix it? I am going to begin with a very simple recommendation. As long as you are watching it not too long from November 2007, and you cannot use Windows Vista or Server 2008, what's on the slide now is a typical recommendation for your average good cryptographic mechanisms, meaning use AES for symmetric encryption with at least 128 bits of key, use RSA algorithm for asymmetric encryption or key exchange with 2048 bits of key. Wherever you can, use the SHA-2 set of hashing functions, and if you can, and especially from a legal perspective, and want to, for digital signatures, use the DSA algorithm. If you cannot use the DSA algorithm, use a combination of SHA-2 and RSA to generate your digital signatures. This is a very simple recommendation. If you don't need any more about cryptography at this point in time, you can leave or switch off the recording and just go and do it. As long as it is not too late from 2007, you should be okay for most purposes. So, what's wrong with the rest? Let me talk to you about, first of all, the things I don't recommend. I do not recommend DES IDEA, Twofish, Blowfish, RC2 or RC5 for various reasons which are on this slide. And I will explain those reasons, but just before I explain them, I want to point your attention towards this little symbol in the lower left corner of the slide. You can probably see there is a little blue eye in the corner. This is an experiment I'm doing for the first time when speaking at TechEd, and hopefully you'll tell me if it works for you or not. You know, anybody who has ever come to my presentations, you probably have seen that my slides typically have like 1 million words on them. And I realized that many of you, getting a little probably older, like me, have spent too much time squinting at those slides. So, for the first time, I have removed about 70% of words from my slides. You can imagine what this one looked like before. Or, if you are still interested in that, and you are now looking at my slides, you simply need to go to the next slide, which is a hidden slide. If you press the H button on your keyboard, you see the previous version, which I'm not going to show you. So, whenever you see this symbol, and you want more information about the subject, there is a hidden slide that follows with more stuff on it. Why didn't I put it in the comments at the bottom of the slide? Because they removed them. So why didn't I do a separate printout? Well, it's not as easy to carry as another slide deck. Why didn't I put it at the end of the presentation? Because nobody ever looks there. So that's why I've got it after every slide. Hopefully it will help you. Right. Why don't I recommend this lovely group of algorithms? They are, after all, the foundation of almost everything we've done in cryptography for years. Well, DES because it is broken fully. DES can be decrypted in real time if you have a little bit of money even, and its keys, of course, are part of the problem, very short keys, but also there's a lot of conspiracy theories about backdoors and other nasty stuff about it. DES is related to triple DES, which is not 3 times as good as DES. In fact, we don't know exactly how much better it is, but whilst it is widely used today, it is an algorithm we are very worried about, and two, it's very slow. There are things which are much faster and much stronger in security. RC2 and RC5 from Mr. Ron Rivest, one of the grandfathers of cryptography, are nice algorithms but outdated. IDEA was a lovely European algorithm to kind of counter the DES popularity from US, but it is outdated. And finally, Blowfish and Twofish are very good, but they are not standardized, and we have something better than Blowfish and Twofish. And of course, the algorithm that I want to recommend to you is AES, also known as Rendel. And any Belgians in the room, please catch me later to correct my pronunciation. Rendel is actually a composition of the names of its inventors, Mr. Raymond and Mr. Damon, which I'm sure I mispronounced also. And it was the winner of the Advanced Encryption Standard competition run in the United States between 1997 and 2000. So you could say it's about 10 years or 7 years old. It's actually a little older than that, and is currently the choice for symmetric encryption. It is nice. It allows you flexibility on the length of input and flexibility on the length of key, and that is pretty much the algorithm that we will be using for the next decade or two, so be friendly with it. By the way, if you are interested in cryptography, you will probably know that AES is also resistant to some amazingly convoluted attacks that probably your organization doesn't yet have to suffer. For example, one fantastically interesting way to break algorithms, expensive but working, or break your encryption on a smart card, for example, is to measure the utilization of electricity by the smart card. As it happens, when an algorithm adds 2 numbers, it uses less electricity than when it multiplies 2 numbers. And it uses even more electricity when it exponentiates something to the power of something else. As a result, there are clever people who will measure electricity usage by a smart card, and they can figure out what the smart card is doing. Well, AES is, you would be pleased to know, resistant, because it perfectly balances the number of additions, multiplications, and exponentiations in order to prevent that form of attack. Nice? Yeah. For paranoid people, probably. Don't use CAST, don't use GHOST. CAST is still popular here and then. You see it in SMIME, especially for compatibility reasons, but it is outdated and it is too short a key. CAST uses 64-bit keys. GHOST, well, that depends, of course, on where you come politically. Now, I have to say it very carefully because last time I delivered a similar presentation, I made a huge political fufu at this stage. So GOST stands for Государственный стандарт, and anybody who comes from either the Russian sphere of political influence or perhaps even from the age before Russia, the Soviet Union, realizes that that was the standard algorithm for protection of all data in that part of the world at the time. Lovely design, almost 610 bits of secrecy, but unfortunately, as it is with politics, it is very much believed that there is a strong backdoor to this algorithm, which means that you should use it if you come from one part of the world and not if you come from the other. That's probably as politically correct as I can put it. RC4 is not recommended. It's a lovely algorithm, and without it, we wouldn't have PPTP. In fact, point-to-point tunneling protocol lived and still lives even with PPTP and here and there. RC4 is a very clever algorithm because it's a stream cipher. It can take a possibly never-ending amount of data and produces an equally never-ending output. But the problem with it, despite its beautiful design, is that, well, it is very weak, because today we have algorithms that can do the same job without having to have such pretty designs. For example, you can simply use a much dirtier design of the AES algorithm, which I already mentioned, and use it in combination with a technique such as cipher block chaining, which every Windows machine will do for you, to encrypt those huge streams of data that you typically encounter in VPN environments. So I don't recommend RC4, but if you must use it, make sure it's 128 bits and make sure that that key is changed often. In some cases, I will recommend exchanging the key every megabyte of data or at least every 30 minutes of a slower connection. However, in most cases, thankfully, VPN can be done using other algorithms today. And if you are interested in why this is so beautiful, learn about the concept of a one-time pad, one of the most beautiful cryptographic algorithms ever to be invented, because it's simple and it's perfect. It cannot be broken. Simple idea. You take an infinite key, or at least as long as your input, consisting of some random data, and you take an infinite, of course, or as long as you need message, and you XOR each with each. As a result, you get beautiful output, so why don't we use it? Well, because it's useless. Why? Because if you need to have a key which is as long as the message, which needs to be sent to the recipient, you might just as well send the message. There are exceptions. If you can pre-share secretly such a key, then you actually don't need any AESs or anything. You could use one-time pad, a simple XOR. Beautiful, but not very useful. RSA, DSA, and LGAMAL, these are all asymmetric algorithms, and they are the workhorse of today's key exchange. Because they are slow, no matter how powerful our computers are, they are slow. We don't normally use them to encrypt data. We only use them to exchange the key with the other side. The most important of those is Rivers, Shamir, Edelman, or RSA algorithm from 1978. Its security is problematic. That's as simple as I can put it, and if you want to know more about it, the next hidden slide explains why. But its security by today's standards worries too many people. We need to replace it as quickly as we can. Digital signature algorithm is not so bad, but it's difficult to use it for other applications than signatures. And the LGAMAL algorithm, if you can use, although not very standardized, is considered one of the best asymmetric algorithms. By the way, let me ask you a question here. I always like to ask this question. How many of you think that either symmetric or asymmetric cryptography is more secure than the other? Who thinks that symmetric cryptography is more secure? Please just wave your hand for a second. Okay, we have 1, 2 people, all right? Who thinks asymmetric is more secure? Well, we have a good few more, about 15, 20 people. And who thinks that they are pretty much the same? Most of you. But a lot of you didn't raise your hand, which is quite good. So, in fact, you are kind of all right, but not really. So one of the big benefits of coming to this session will reveal itself now. In reality, those who were brave enough to raise hand at the beginning were closest to the truth, because according to today's standards, symmetric cryptography is probably the most secure. However, I don't even like to say that. I prefer to say that they are equivalent, and you cannot compare them without knowing the length of keys and the application. Really, 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 if you pushed me to the wall and you said, which one is more secure? I would probably edge on the symmetric side because we have fewer problems with them. But symmetric algorithms need key exchange. So we use asymmetric algorithms with additional things to exchange the keys securely, which minimizes the problems of asymmetric cryptography because we are encrypting very little data, only the key. And that's why they are sometimes considered, as some of you thought, more secure, because we are not encrypting your file, we are not encrypting your string, we are only encrypting the key. So be careful. It's definitely not the case that one is better or the other. It's the combination that matters. Oh, dear me. If you really want to find one area of cryptography that's totally broken, here you are. Hashing functions, which we all use all the time. MD5, so popular, totally broken in July 2004, 3 years ago. Avoid using it on its own if you have a better choice. SHA is also broken. SHA-0, which thankfully is not a real-world algorithm, but simply an idea on the base of which SHA-1 has been built, is broken, while SHA-1 is considered weak or even partly broken, and there are people who allege that it was even fully broken, although that's questionable. There are very few choices in hashing that exist today. I think we are running into a hashing disaster very quickly. Like in the next few years, 5 to 10 years, we are going to have a problem. SHA-256 is okay, but only because it's longer, not because it has a better design. So all we are doing is we are simply buying ourselves some time. I'm not happy because of that. Does it matter to you? Probably and probably not. It depends what you do. If you are in the business of simply protecting your data, and you don't have to guarantee anything to anyone else, it probably doesn't matter too much. Because although these breaks are real, they are very difficult to exploit, except for MD5, which is quite easy now. However, if you are called the world's foremost certification authority, and you guarantee other people's security with your choice of hashing, you do have a problem because you cannot guarantee that. Which is why a lot of world's biggest CAs have recently rewritten their contracts, simply to cover for the liability issues caused by this. So if you're in the banking business, well, in some ways it's the easiest thing to measure because you simply need to know how much data is worth, over what period of time, and you will easily discover that most of the time SHA-2 will be good enough for most of your day-to-day banking needs, including almost any online banking application. MD5? I don't think so. Is MD5 more widely used or SHA-2? I can guess. SHA-2 is not even 2% of world use. So if you are in the online banking situation and you are relying on MD5 for compatibility, you have a problem. Thankfully, probably you have better ways to overcome this problem than by means of cryptography, so that even if somebody does something nasty, there are other ways to prevent the problem from spilling. Diffie-Hellman, SSL, and certificates, in the simplest way, are basically mechanisms for key exchange. Different ways. Diffie-Hellman is the coolest of them all because it generates a new key pair whenever you need it. So every cryptographic session with Diffie-Hellman creates a fresh pair of keys. But you can do it manually by giving certificates to people or automatically by distributing the certificates and verifying trust based on them by means of secure sockets layer, the very well-known SSL protocol, of course known to everyone as it's used, for example, for HTTPS, as long as you have the public key infrastructure. So that's the situation we have today. As you can see, some of it is okay, some of it is broken, some of it is very worrying. What's the cryptography in Windows Vista and Windows 2008 going to do for you that will make your data more secure? Suite B. Suite B is, at the moment, one of the nicest answers to most of the problems I specified earlier, not all. Suite B is the United States National Security Agency's and National Institute of Standards and Technology recommendation, and I'm very pleased to say that Microsoft have been very fast with Suite B. Windows Vista is the first commercially available operating system that fully supports Suite B and has been doing that for a while. Suite B is, of course, at the heart of Windows Server 2008. And when I say at heart, I mean it. Inside it, I mean not like at Microsoft in Redmond, but in the code of the server and the code of the client, Microsoft will always rely on the Suite B algorithms rather than something weaker if it's possible and if the standards allow it. In some cases, Microsoft will even extend the standard to use it if need be, and I'll tell you in a minute where. We normally don't like when Microsoft extends standards, but there is one situation where it's very important, and I'm glad they did it. I'll show you in a minute. Of course, if you want to use DES, please leave this room. Sorry, no. If you want to use DES, you certainly can. Microsoft is not removing any of the algorithms that were there. You can use everything we had before, you just probably shouldn't. And sometimes you may need to tweak the system a little to force it to use the old stuff, but it's there. It's not used by default, which is pretty good news, of course. So who will be using Suite B? First and foremost, American United States governmental purposes will have to use it on a variously increasing basis from the next year onwards. In general, US government, the federal needs, I should say, of the government, denote that Suite B is for all applications up to the military secret and top secret level, which interestingly, for the first time in the history of American cryptography means that the American civilian and military users will use exactly the same algorithms up to the secret and top secret level. That's very interesting. What does it mean? Well, that means two things. Either that the algorithm is really good and there is no backdoor, because if there was a backdoor, then of course the friends from the other side of the world, let's say generally east of Ukraine and onwards, would probably know how to get in there. So it cannot have a backdoor. What's the other alternative? The other alternative is that top secret is really not secret anymore, and that there are many, many more levels above it. And we know that is the case to some extent because the United States defines that any user over that level must use the Suite A of algorithms. If you would like to know what is Suite A, please hack this URL, which leads you to Suite B, replace B with an A, and at various points in time, you will either receive a blank page or a lovely page which thanks you for your interest. However, it promises to offer no explanation as it happens to be above the top secret level. Actually, we know that US nuclear purposes are primarily, or I should say protection of nuclear facilities is primarily the area of application for Suite A, which kind of makes you feel a little bit better that at least you know which protocols these things use when they fly over your head and look into your back garden. Indulge me. This is first day of TechEd. You are all fresh, you had a good rest, beautiful weekend, Barcelona is lovely. So let me give you a little bit of mathematics. Only 2 slides. Many cryptographic algorithms use a concept of so-called discrete logarithms at the heart of their design. Basically, most algorithms use something that's easy one way, but difficult the other way. And there are many things which are easy to do one way, but difficult the other. One of them are discrete logarithms. What's a discrete logarithm? Well, first of all, what's a logarithm? Logarithm is the opposite of exponentiation. So when you take a and you raise it to the power of b, that's exponentiation. All right, so that's easy. Now, if you take a to the power of b modulus n, and you know, modulus n is like counting to 100 on just 10 fingers. That's modulus 10, right? So a to the power of b modulus n is known as discrete exponentiation. So if you take the opposite of that, that's a discrete logarithm. So basically, over 1 over something to the power of something modulus something else. This modulus thing is what makes the logarithm discrete and what makes it very, very difficult to reverse. Not impossible, just difficult. So here's the cool thing. Instead of this modulus thing, we can do something different. This algebra of doing these exponentiations modulus something else is basically a particular application of what is known as algebra over a finite field of an abelian group, which is formed by the operations in the modulus integer space. What is amazing is that there are other types of algebras that we can use to build such operations like a logarithm. Instead of multiplying two numbers, which are very big, we can multiply points on a curve. Basically, these integers have to be awfully long. How long? Typically, 2048 bits are needed to represent one of those integers. So they are not your normal integers that the processor uses on a daily basis, but much more gigantic numbers. So instead of using these normal integers or these long integers, we can multiply in a different way. How? It's a little bit of vector-based geometrical calculation. We point a curve which looks a little bit like that, like a big letter E. That curve is known as an elliptical curve because of certain properties it has, and each bit of data is represented as a point somewhere on the curve. It has to fall on the curve somewhere. And as it falls somewhere on the curve, you simply add 2 points together, or multiply points together, or exponentiate the points together by doing a little bit of simple geometrically calculations, which happen as a result to create another point somewhere else on this curve. So instead of adding numbers, we simply somehow compose the points. And what's so special about those elliptical curves? What's special about them is that it turns out they're incredibly efficient. Whilst we need 2,000 bits to represent a long integer number to do some of the calculations, with elliptical curve, we don't need so much. In fact, to represent a 1,000-bit key used in the RSA algorithm, you need only about 192 bits of an elliptical curve algorithm. That's almost the power of 10. And you know what happens when you make things shorter in computers, especially by such a big amount. Suddenly things become faster, suddenly they are becoming more efficient, and, as it turns out, harder to break, easier to write software for, even easier to create hardware that can perform some of these applications. So elliptical curve cryptography is not new cryptography at all. It just takes the old algorithms and applies them in this fancy way over the elliptical curves to perform operations faster with fewer bits of key. So in fact, elliptical curve cryptography, you could say, is even an easier form of traditional cryptography, which should be the case, that we always discover the simpler things after we discover the more complicated things, but that's, I guess, the nature of IT. So for example, let's take the Diffie-Hellman algorithm or the DSA algorithm, and instead of integers, let's just do it on the curves. The only thing you need to remember from this mathematical bit, if you are not so much interested in the details, is that whenever we used to say key in the past, because we want to make it look more difficult, we will now talk about elliptical curve moduli. So whenever you read and says an elliptical curve moduli, simply remember, it's just the key. It's just a new way to call it. So now you can go to your colleagues back at work and show off. All right. SWIDB algorithms are simply AES for encryption, elliptical curve DSA for signatures, elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman or elliptical curve NQV, more about it in a minute, for key exchange, and SHA-2 for hashing. Unfortunately, we have nothing better than that. So let me walk you through them one by one very quickly. The AES that is used in Suite B is simply the good old AES we always had, with some things not used and some things used in a particular way. Most importantly, the standard says we don't use 192 bits, we use 128 or 256 keys. Although Microsoft does support the middle version, the standard doesn't ask for it. What I want you to understand immediately also is that the 256 bits are much slower than 128, and they are not twice as secure. Never ever assume that twice the key means twice the security. That almost never is the case. And also, when you compare one algorithm with another, don't just compare the keys numerically, because there are differences of a different nature. Here, we typically say that as of November 2007, most of you would be okay with 83 bits of key. So my message to you is that probably for most of you, 128 bits is good for everything. And especially if you need efficiency or speed, it is definitely good enough. And now we come to one of the first big important changes in Windows Vista and Windows Server 2008, which will affect all of you somehow. Kerberos. Kerberos version 5 has been ever so slightly extended by Microsoft, which is a good thing. One of the biggest problems we have with Kerberos is that Kerberos, apart from being a beautiful algorithm, uses DES for encryption. Ugh. Well, there is a solution. If your Kerberos tickets expire very quickly, they are very short-lived, or you don't use them to protect the big button that launches the missile, you're probably okay. But just in case, if Vista smells that it's talking to a Windows Server 2008 domain Active Directory, they will both say, I know you know I know. And they will switch to AES, which makes me a very happy person. If client is XP or another OS, sadly that will not happen. Will it always work? Probably, yeah, but just in case, look the MSDS-supported encryption types attribute in Active Directory if you want to polish exactly what is selected in what case. For what I have seen, there are cases where I have Vista and I have Windows 2008. For some reason, they are still not using AES. And there are situations where I have an other operating system, like XP, and Server 2008, and they will not authenticate because the server is insisting on AES, which XP doesn't want to do. So much right now for the beta that we are all, of course, enjoying to a varying degree of Windows Server 2008. I'm sure Microsoft will polish this out before they release it, but right now, watch out for this parameter. I think this is one of the most important changes in this new environment. So when you hear Microsoft says like Vista and Windows Server better together, that's not just a reference to an old American advertising slogan, but it's many things like that. Digital signatures under Suite B is simply the DSA algorithm over elliptical curves. Nothing more to say about it other than use it if you can, but in many European Union applications we don't use this combination. Instead we use a combination today of RSA and SHA, in which case just use AES and SHA-2 if you can. If you can use DSA, I don't think there's anything too wrong with it. By the way, in addition to the 256 and 384 moduli, Microsoft also allows you to use 521 bits of key. That's not a typo. It's not 512, which I misspelled. It is 521, and there is a reason for that. The best bit of Suite B is the key exchange. That is why we really need Suite B, is because we have all those problems with RSA. So instead of the RSA algorithm, we now use an older algorithm than RSA, which is kind of amazing. 2 years older than RSA is Diffie-Hellman. However, in this modern application over elliptical curves, the algorithm works well. You can choose either the 256 or 384 bit keys, as you remember the curve moduli, In both cases, there will be pretty much enough for most of your applications. Just to give you a feel, 256 moduli is somewhere around 3,000, some even claim 4,000 bit RSA key. So we have huge leverage here in terms of how we are improving performance by going to this algorithm, not just the extra strength. However, Microsoft also supports the non-standard 521 bits if you wish to use so. One thing, to use this algorithm correctly, you need to have some form of additional authentication or pre-existing trust, for the reason of which the Suite B standard defines an alternative known as MQV, for Menezes, Koo, and Vanstone protocol application of the Diffie-Hellman algorithm. If you've already had enough, just look at the last line. Unfortunately, Microsoft don't support this right now, although it is in Suite B. Maybe they will in the future. However, for those of you who need to understand Suite B well, you'll be well advised to look on the next hidden slide to understand how it is done. It's a very, very simple modification to Diffie-Hellman that solves the problem of the lack of trust that the Diffie-Hellman algorithm cannot solve, but which it requires to be fulfilled before you use it. You know what? It really doesn't matter. In most applications, those two algorithms are fine. You will just find one day something else that wants to talk MQV to you, and you will only be able to talk Diffie-Hellman. In most cases, that other thing will change to Diffie-Hellman after using an additional form of authentication, for example, by means of certificates. Hashing, sadly, no good news here. Microsoft implements, of course, the necessary ones, plus additional different lengths of hashes, of which I simply say use 256 and 512-bit hashes whenever you can, preferably the longer one. It is slow. I have to say that 512-bit hash takes forever compared to 56. Don't use 384. Why? Because it's silly. Why is it silly? Because the 384 algorithm actually is the 512 algorithm. It runs forever and then just discards the unnecessary bits. So you might just as well use the 512 algorithm if you need to. I think we have a problem here anyway, and in a few years, maybe a decade, we will need something drastically new for hashing. What if you have a problem with hashing today and you need now something? Use encryption. Yeah, you can use AES to generate a hash. It's just that the hash will be as long as the message itself, so it's not very practical. But if your message is very short, there's no problem with that, right? Enough about all of those lovely cryptographic things. Now that I have enabled you to understand everything there is today to know about modern forms of cryptography, let's apply it to those typical needs such as IPsec, SMIME, such as encrypting file system, BitLocker, of course, and information rights management. 5 short sections in my presentation, beginning with IPsec. IPsec, or IP security, is your layer 3 security mechanism for protection of data on the wire, specifically for endpoint authentication and for host-to-host security of communication at the network level. Is it an end-to-end solution? No. You cannot use IPsec to have security all the way from an application to an application. Sadly, IPsec works at a lower level, basically level 3 in IP, so unless you are tunneling, in which case you can, IPsec has a limited application for application security needs, but huge purpose for network security. IPsec is optional in the current version of the IP protocol known as IP version 4. However, it is a required component of IP version 6. And although I'm not talking about IP version 6 in this session, there is a session on next generation of networking, Windows Server 2008, which I hopefully will see some of you attend towards the end of the week. It's on Thursday and repeated due to its popularity on Friday, apparently. When should you use IPsec? Wherever you can. As I said earlier, it's an onion. So whenever you add the layers of security, you get more security. Not necessarily much more, and maybe it will be too expensive for you to maintain it, but if you can afford it, use it. In particular, prioritize for the following applications. I like IPsec for domain controller communications. I like IPsec for isolation of the server and the domain controller. I like IPsec very much for certain forms of authentication and authorization and communication with things outside of your network. I don't like IPsec for protecting Wi-Fi. I don't like it for protecting wireless spectrum. If you need to protect the wireless spectrum communications, a much better choice is WPA2 together with some form of 802.1x. 802.1x, by the way, has an awful lot of innovation in Vista and in Windows Server 2008, when Microsoft have added both 802.1x for wired applications, and they also enhanced the way you can manage it through policies. So no need to use IPsec in that scenario. Is IPsec the same as VPN? Is it the same as virtual private networks? No. Virtual private networks are on a higher level of abstraction. VPNs are about topology, routing, tunneling, putting something big and squeezing it through a small channel. So VPN can use IPsec if you want to, and that's a fairly nice thing to do, especially in Windows 2008 with the way they've updated that. However, at the end of the day, the way the data is encrypted in both will be very similar. So although IPsec encrypts almost the same way as some of the VPN technologies not using IPsec, don't confuse the two, because they are for two different layers of abstraction in terms of purpose. All right, so you decided you will be using IPsec, but how will you configure it? Let me give you my recommendations for IPsec now. And if you want more debate of why and where and which settings, the next slide, which is hidden, provides, of course, that. First of all, for the encrypting security payload, in other words, if you use IPsec for confidentiality of data, which is one of two key reasons, please, please, please use AES, especially if you are using IPv6. If you use IPv4, you may find yourself in a situation where you cannot use AES because it is very much not yet supported across the platform. In that case, triple DES is your choice. Triple DES is a slow algorithm, it works well, but whenever you can, use AES. You will be very pleased to hear that Microsoft have finally removed DES as a choice of cryptography for IPsec in Windows Server 2008. And yes, you can add it back by hacking the registry, and that is described to some extent in the next slide, should you need to, but I hope you don't have to. For key exchange, use Diffie-Hellman wherever you can, and if you cannot, the variant of Diffie-Hellman which Microsoft introduced already in Windows Server 2003, known as Oakley, will work for you very well. It's actually a protocol application of Diffie-Hellman rather than another protocol. And for hashing, well, for IPv6 you can use SHA-2 right now. If you don't use IPv6, you will have to use SHA-1, avoid MD5, although it is a choice, and indeed, just rely on using IPsec for data integrity protection rather than for cryptography at the level of confidentiality of data if you need only that application. The final thing I want to say about IPsec is a few words about its authentication. Authenticating host to host, or I should say endpoints which are hosts to each other, can be done in three different ways using IPsec. First of all, the greatest is the new Kerberos. Now, don't underestimate that, because that suddenly means with all of the new extensions and add-ons, we have many ways how we can authenticate what previously was not identifiable. Do you know what I'm talking about? NAP. You probably have heard network access protection. If you haven't heard, there are sessions about it. It's going to be one of your favorite technologies for the next decade. You will be working with it and having fun with it for the next 10 years, most likely. One of the choices you have when you use network access protection to enforce that the client that's unhealthy doesn't talk to you is by means of IPsec. And one of the ways you can now do it is because you can verify for the presence of client and machine certificates. In other words, Kerberos and those techniques all can be used together in IPsec for authentication. This is a pretty nice mechanism. Other than that, traditional certificates, PKI of course, or the worst choice you could use, but one of the easiest ones to implement is of course a pre-shared key or a password, which pretty much shouldn't be used in corporate scenarios. It's okay for perhaps some people's home networks, certainly not mine. I had to say a word about virtual private networks at this stage. I know IPsec is not VPN, but this is such a nice, cool new feature of Windows Server 2008. I should say Windows Server 2008 and Vista Service Pack 1. Perhaps I'm even the first session to mention that openly. Yes, indeed. Vista Service Pack 1 and Windows Server 2008 introduce SSTP. SSTP is a secure socket tunneling protocol. What is it? It's basically PPTP over HTTPS. I should say PPP over HTTPS. In other words, you've blocked in your organization carefully every port apart from 80 and 443, so that means it's very difficult to establish VPNs using the old-fashioned stuff such as IPsec, because of course none of the ports are open. So now we have a protocol called SSTP, which will actually go across your firewall and allow people to establish a VPN if they wanted to. Okay. Frightening and convenient. Convenient if you need to connect to your network while you are traveling. None of those you have to pay an extra fee for your Wi-Fi in the hotel to do VPN. How many times have you stayed in a hotel? It's going to be like 15 euros. If you don't use VPN, it will be like 150 euros for 24 hours if you want to VPN into your network. Well, now you have a solution. That will work even for 15 euros in those hotels. Which is probably one of the good reasons. The other thing that Microsoft changed, PPTP now only supports 128-bit version of RC4, which I do not recommend. And if you really need to hack it around, you can enable the old ones. I don't think you should. I think those are very good and important choices. So pretty cool stuff with regards to the security provided by VPNs. S/MIME. S/MIME is, of course, secure multi-purpose internet mail extension, and it is a kind of a secured version of MIME, if some people want to think of it that way. In fact, S/MIME uses the MIME syntax, but it works very differently from MIME. Office 2007 uses S/MIME version 3. Previously to that, we had version 2. It is used traditionally for sending encrypted or digitally signed email messages from somebody's mail reader, such as Microsoft Outlook, to somebody else's mail reader, perhaps Microsoft Entourage or some other technology out there. What is important, of course, here is that this technology is of very little use if you use webmail. It actually is almost meaningless in a webmail scenario. Not useless. There are situations where you may want to send an S/MIME protected message through an already SSL encrypted connection to your webmail, but only if you really trust an awful lot of things along the line. And certainly I have a problem with people digitally signing webmail to be sent out as S/MIME. So normally this really works when you have a fat client, or I should say smart client, traditional Outlook, and perhaps some other readout, the Eudora or Pegasus, if you still use those. And of course for digital signatures, where it provides for integrity of the message, non-repudiation, yes, I wrote it, authenticity and identity of the author. If you want to use S/MIME, despite this technology being so well matured, there's an awful lot of things you have to do. First of all, they have to have certificates, which they either get from a well-respected consumer-oriented certification authority, or, your choice of course, from the Active Directory certificate services in Windows Server 2008, or from the certificate services for Windows Server 2003. The older version of the server supported, but it is a little bit more gunky and more difficult to do. If you've done it, congratulations. If you haven't, consider Server 2008 for this reason, or 2003, as it makes it much easier. What if you need to send encrypted messages to your partner company and you need this trust to be mutually recognized? You have three choices. One, use a globally known certificate authority. Easy, but politically sometimes difficult. It's sometimes impossible to guarantee things this way because of the policies that certificate authorities of that nature place upon us. Two, new kid on the block for this purpose is, of course, Active Directory Federation Services. One of the nicest things you will notice in Windows Server 2008 is the whole GUI interface to ADFS, where it is really very easy to establish trust between companies, for example, to have S/MIME. So ADFS is no longer this wall technology, but a very practical one you can use for S/MIME, for example. Or the old-fashioned way, cross-digitally sign each other's root certificate at the top of their PKI infrastructure, if you trust them, of course, because once you digitally sign it, that signature is impossible to remove. Algorithms, because this technology is so well old, we have so many of them, and most of them not very good, as you know already from my introduction. Sadly, AES is too rarely implemented by other people to be your best choice. So unfortunately, you probably have to use Triple DES. Triple DES is probably the most natural choice here because everybody has it, and it works, of course, with all the versions of Office. But if you don't have that limitation, I recommend you consider turning on the Suite B mode. This is just a policy setting in the policies for Office 2007, which you can apply using your favorite group policy tool. A few recommendations. If you send email always to the same few partners, and say you have 7 partners with whom you want to have encrypted email, exchange the keys and then enforce it on your email server. This is a very little used but powerful feature of both Exchange 2003 and 2007, which allows you to say that for certain domains with which you communicate, you will enforce the choice of S/MIME with specific algorithms, meaning that if someone has not selected that, the message is bounced to them with a send again button, and they actually have to turn on the encryption. This is a pretty cool mechanism, and I certainly like it and used it very many times. If you have higher security needs, use additional packages. PGP is probably one of the most famous one, and mentioning that in this session is one of the few advantages of the session being delivered by a non-Microsoft speaker. But BitLocker. Now that I told you so much about cryptography, there's actually very little I need to tell you about BitLocker. So I will tell you very little, and I'll give you probably the most uninteresting demonstration that you will see during this conference. Now that's exciting. Trusted Platform Module, TPM, is really the required component. Yes, you can use BitLocker without it, and it makes sense in some cases, but you really get the power of it when you have it. Why? Remember at the beginning when I said you have to protect things physically? BitLocker protects things by cryptography, and its key is protected by cryptography with another key and with another key. But that last key on the top is the key to the kingdom, and you need to stick it somewhere. TPM is a good place to keep it because it protects the key, and it also discovers dangerous modifications to the OS, dangerous modifications to the boot process. Things like, for example, the hard drive being exchanged for another one. An awful lot of things that are done when someone wants to steal your data or your keys. If somebody wants to break into your organization, they normally begin by stealing somebody's laptop from your company. That laptop comes with so many keys to everything. Half of your domain structure will be there. After that, as you can guess, it's actually very easy to at least guess what I need to do to break into your organization. BitLocker makes that pretty much impossible. Its purposes are manifold, but the key one is protection of hardware in case of theft, integrity assurance of the OS when it loads, as well as protection of the key assets for other mechanisms of security. As you will see in a minute, I will still recommend you use encrypting file system. But the encrypting file system has keys which need to be protected somewhere else. Well, BitLocker is a good place to protect the keys of the EFS and of other things. And the really good news with BitLocker right now is that whilst on Vista it protects normally just the volume containing the operating system, on Windows Server 2008 it will actually protect any volume you have on your server. It's fast, 5 to 6% degradation in terms of CPU utilization, except for extreme situations where you are reading multimedia high definition stuff and server applications. So what about using BitLocker on a server? Well, what about it? I'll say in a minute. Right now, a word about algorithms. Suite B. BitLocker has been designed with Suite B in mind, which is very easy then to explain, because there's really nothing else to say other than, well, it uses AES 128 with a so-called diffuser. Those of you who are interested in which diffuser, that diffuser is called Elephant, and prevents ciphertext manipulation of data in case somebody gets your laptop, changes the encrypted disk and gives it back to you. The Elephant makes it very difficult for them to do that kind of manipulation. If you want to, you could introduce a higher level, but the performance will significantly go down if you switch to AES 256. Keys are managed using AES 256, which is good. The recovery key for BitLocker in case it breaks is a 128-bit key, in other words 48 digits, and that is the weakest point of BitLocker, which is another reason why it probably doesn't make much sense to use AES 256 for the encryption of data itself. So a few recommendations regarding BitLocker. First of all, choose where you use it. Use it only on machines which are physically insecure, laptops, some workstations, but what about servers? Yes, if they are in a physically insecure location. So maybe some branch offices, maybe a server that comes in some kind of a consumer device that you want to protect. Would I put BitLocker on your main domain controller that's hit as heavily as possible, that's already in your protected data center? Very unlikely. However, if you do, make sure that you understand how to further protect the key of the BitLocker. TPM is good, but if somebody is going to steal your entire server, they probably will think that BitLocker may already be there, and they probably will be prepared for that eventuality. So there are some really clever tricks you can do here. One thing you can do, I guess because I tell it now to everyone, it's not going to be so good after some time, but one of the things you can do is you can further protect the BitLocker with a dongle. Maybe USB key, or even better, a more intelligent dongle, which you will put in the wall behind the server or in the floor, and you'll connect it with a really thin and almost invisible USB cable. When somebody steals the server, they break the cable because it's very, very delicate, and they don't have the additional protection mechanism. In that case, they will typically be thwarted by TPMs locking up, and they typically won't be able to get your data. Pretty cool technique. I actually had a customer that has used it not with BitLocker, but with a different technology. For extra security, remove the BitLocker keys from the escrow, such as the Active Directory's domain services. But of course, your users will forget the keys. So for extra convenience to yourselves, consider putting the keys in the Active Directory escrow so that in case they forget the keys, you can retrieve them. So if you have a user that is really good at not forgetting passwords, anybody has one of those? In that case, you could consider giving them extra security. For vast majority of us, myself included, probably that extra recovery ease is going to be a somewhat more important aspect. So I've recommended a few things to you about BitLocker. How about I give you the most unexciting demo? This is Windows Server 2008. I'm going to go to the control panel, and in here I will find the BitLocker drive encryption, which you have to add as a feature of the server. By default, it is not installed. You have to do it through Add Feature Wizard. I'm going to double-click on it, and as you can see, I already encrypted my Windows volume, but I haven't encrypted my data volume. So you simply click on Turn on BitLocker, and in a minute you will see a warning saying that if you do it on the server, you really need to know what you are doing, because it will unfortunately decrease the performance of your server. I am not worried about it, so I'm going to say OK. And it asks me now to save the recovery password somewhere. I'm going to print it because I like paper, except because I don't have a printer right here. I'm just going to write it as an XPS file, and I'm going to put it in this most secure location of the all, which is the root of the C drive. You probably shouldn't do that. In fact, printing the password to XPS ideally should be something that should be impossible, but, well, maybe in next version. Next, encrypt the volume, encrypt, And at this point, well, that's it. In about 2 hours, the volume will be encrypted. Well, that was my exciting demo. You still need to use encrypting file system. You still need EFS, because whilst BitLocker protected your computer against theft, EFS will protect shared files and files which can travel away from the laptop. So in your work group, on a SharePoint server, perhaps on other servers, these files are not protected by BitLocker when they leave your computer. So that means that there is many good reasons to use EFS. EFS is easy to use, right-click encrypt that, but really you should manage it with group policies. For example, there is a new lovely policy in Windows Server 2008 that simply enables EFS for the documents folder of all of your users. EFS uses both old and new. There are a few interesting weirdnesses here. So yes, you can use AES, thankfully 256 or any other version if you want to. You can use triple DES, I don't recommend on account of speed, and you can even use DESX, which please you shouldn't really use because it is a rather unusual algorithm originally created for Microsoft's needs many years ago, derived, I don't like to say derived from DES because it's actually very different from DES, but that's where it originated. Key exchange is where you're going to stumble a little bit. While Suite B is fully supported in Vista and Windows Server 2008, if you use any other system, of course you have to rely on simpler algorithms, but the real problem you'll find with EFS is that, I'm not going to go into great detail of that, but whichever algorithm for encryption you use, although it may belong to this new group of Suite B algorithms, it also must be supported by the old-fashioned Crypto API version 1 API on the machine. So if your server has algorithms which are part of Suite B, which Crypto API doesn't support, you cannot use them. So you can actually use AES because that happens to be supported. You cannot use some of the more clever algorithms you have seen before. So it is perhaps a compromise in this release of Windows Server. A few recommendations. Do it at the departmental level and use Active Directory to store every user's public key. That's not a security problem, that's a security good thing to do. The private key, traditionally we would have put where? Well, somewhere secure, but before Windows 2008, you couldn't put it on a smart card. With Windows 2008, you can put it on a smart card, which is good, but it is no longer necessary to do so because, of course, BitLocker can be used to protect the EFS key. And BitLocker in turn is protected by a kind of a smart card, which is the TPM. With Windows XP, well, in the end, you do rely on the strength of the user's password, so that's pretty much not a good level of security. And remember, EFS does not replace, it merely extends BitLocker's security to files which are shared across your organization. Information rights management is the very last data protection area that you will need to be aware of while you are building your strategy. IRM has a different purpose. Make it difficult for the user to print, forward, or even sometimes read the message or other document that was given to them. I don't like to think of IRM as a very powerful technology in terms of confidentiality, because it isn't. It's just an inconvenience to the user. On the client, you can use Office 2007, where it's very easy, or Office 2003, where it is also easy. You can also use SharePoint 2007, and of course the new Internet Explorer and the previous version, both 6 and 7, come with a plugin that will support the technology. IRM relies on rights management services, which are called in Windows Server 2008 Active Directory Rights Management Services, because they integrated as a role, and in 2003 they were known as RMS, and please make sure you have at least Service Pack 1 for them. The foundation of this technology is very much connected to the concept of digital rights management. And we know that we have many issues with that technology. Certainly, the enterprise side of DRM, ERM, Enterprise Rights Management, is perhaps less questionable than DRM, but those technologies are linked to each other, and you need to think twice about what that means wherever you come from in this world. Key protection can be done with smart cards. However, the machine key itself cannot use the smart card with the current version of IRM and RMS, it uses a technology known as a lockbox, which makes me both happy and unhappy. Makes me unhappy because lockbox is fairly easy to break, which makes me very happy because lockbox is fairly easy to break. Why? You see, if they did it the proper way, then they would have unbreakable DRM. And that's probably not what we want to have at this stage in our development of the democratic understanding whether DRM is a good or a bad thing. And I don't want to offend anybody on this subject because I don't know whether you work or not for one of the big companies that think DRM is a great idea. So let's just say that at this moment it is a technology with a few question marks over it. IRM uses many different algorithms. Yes, it uses strong algorithms, it uses AES, it uses RSA, it uses authentication with smart cards, but because at the end of the day there is this logbox technology, anybody who is really knowledgeable about it can break it. And last but not least about IRM, even if you have unbreakable IRM, how will you prevent the user from doing this to your document? So, don't worry about IRM in terms of being unbreakable. All right, let me put it all together for you. Data protection on the Windows platform is at the lowest level about things like IPsec on the wire. You use IRM, ERM, or RMS to prevent users from doing things they shouldn't, like print a document. Use BitLocker to protect the machine that they carry with themselves. EFS for the files that share across the organization, and SMIME outside of the organization. The only thing that's not in the picture that perhaps I should have mentioned would have been the SSL technology, but that is really for a very different purpose, which is why we didn't talk about it in this session. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I have managed to show you that data protection is at the very heart, at the innermost level of your defense in depth, and it uses cryptography. Please never rely on any one technology. Assume that you have to have a few because someone will break through one or two of them. Do risk assessment. Don't spend all of your money on IPsec because you will have no money for EFS or SMIME. Remember, Windows Vista and Server 2008 change a lot, most of the time for the better, and certainly they introduce what is today the cutting edge of cryptographic technologies, which hopefully you will use to get more security for your data. But just before I leave you, I want to say one thing. Any cryptographers in the room, if you would like to try to compare your ability to break Enigma, you know, the historical device, the British National Museum of Computing is running a competition next week, which I just had to advertise at this point. It will be actually this week. It's going to be on November the 15th. You can try to break Enigma by comparing your ability with Colossus. Other than that, all that I need to do is to very politely and kindly ask you to complete an evaluation form and enjoy TechEd, and see you again.